Welcome back to Smart Enough. Through my work with students and young professionals across Canada, I've noticed that the same questions keep coming up about projects, priorities, prosperity, and how decisions actually get made. So this is the first of a 5-part series exploring those questions and the ideas behind them. So the question I want to explore first is, why is it so hard to build anything? A housing development, a transit line, a bridge, a pipeline, a nuclear plant, even your group project. Most people think progress happens when one side wins and the other side loses, but that's not usually how things move forward. Progress happens when people stop focusing only on what they need to protect and start asking, what would it take to move forward? Because every successful negotiation eventually comes down to the same question. What am I willing to give up to achieve something bigger? Let's get into it. Now, one thing I've noticed about almost every difficult conversation I've observed or been a part of is that people tend to start in the same place. What do I want? What do I need? What am I unwilling to give up? And those are important questions. But if everybody starts there and stays there, nothing moves. Think about buying a house. The buyer wants a lower price. The seller wants a higher price. If both insist on getting everything they want, there's no deal and no one lives anywhere. The same thing happens in relationships, in business, in group projects, and of course, in nation building. Eventually, somebody has to stop asking, how do I win everything I want? And start asking, how do we move forward? So recently, I helped organize a Young Canadians for Resources policy competition. It was built around a challenge Canada is wrestling with right now. So the students, they were asked to negotiate a memorandum of understanding around a certain major project. Now, some of them represented industry, some represented governments of different sorts, Indigenous communities, some represented environmental interests, others represented groups affected by the outcome. What made the exercise interesting is that none of these stakeholders are monoliths. And what do I mean by that? Industry isn't one opinion. A government doesn't represent one opinion. Indigenous communities also aren't one opinion, even environmental organizations, not one opinion. Each single stakeholder actually represents many people with different priorities, responsibilities, concerns, and goals, which just makes the whole thing more complicated. So, back to the competition. Before negotiations began, every team had to prepare their stakeholder position, that complex group that they represented. They were asked what matters most to them, what are you trying to protect, what outcomes are you pursuing? Good. And then came the negotiation round. And here, the competition's objective changed. The goal was no longer to simply defend a position. The ultimate goal was to reach an agreement, to find a path forward. Not a perfect outcome, a workable one. And to help them do that, every student team had to answer 3 questions. Number 1, what are your priorities? Number 2, what are 2 things you absolutely need to move this forward? And 3, and this is important, what's one thing you want but you're willing to give up? And I think that's a pretty powerful framework and one we wanted to model for students, because if you're unwilling to give up anything, you're not really negotiating, you're making demands. So, as I watched the students work through the exercise, I was struck by how quickly they adapted. They didn't stop advocating for their stakeholders. They didn't stop protecting their respective interests, but they quickly started looking for overlap. They started identifying trade-offs. They started asking what could be adjusted, exchanged, or improved in order to move the conversation forward. And it reminded me that this is exactly what Canadians are being asked to do right now. Not just on major projects, but on housing, on affordability, on infrastructure, on economic growth. The challenge is rarely getting everyone to agree. The challenge is just finding enough common ground to make progress possible. So, in fact, that's exactly why the students were studying the Alberta Federal Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, in the first place. That agreement isn't finished. The negotiation is still happening, and that's what makes it interesting. Nobody involved expects to get everything they want. The federal government has priorities, Alberta has priorities, BC has priorities, industry has priorities, Indigenous communities have priorities. The challenge isn't deciding whether priorities exist, The challenge is deciding which ones matter most and, importantly, where there's enough common ground to move forward. In other words, the same exercise the students were working through is the same exercise real decision makers are working through right now here in Canada. So here's something I've noticed. Most people walk into a negotiation focused on protecting their interests, and they should. That's part of your job. But progress doesn't happen when everyone just protects everything. Progress happens when people identify what matters most. Because once you know your priorities, you can start making trade-offs. And trade-offs are how agreements happen. That's how relationships work, it's how organizations work, it's how countries move forward. Priorities create trade-offs, and then trade-offs create progress. So as we go forward looking at these big projects, big questions that we're all facing, maybe the better question isn't, how do I get everything I want? Because that's not really a negotiation. Maybe the better question we should all be asking when we're part of these conversations or thinking about it for ourselves is, how do we get to yes? Because once you've asked that, a harder question follows, which is, what am I willing to give up to make progress possible? Because getting to yes is not about abandoning your interests. It's about knowing which interests or priorities matter most. And if everybody protects everything all the time, nothing moves. But when people are willing to trade something smaller for something bigger, that's when progress begins. Next time, we'll explore another question that shows up everywhere, from business to government to major projects. And that is, if a project is good, why doesn't it always get chosen? I'm Lynn Exner, and this is Smart Enough.